it was all too common where a young person would arrive at the housing option service saying that they'd been kicked out by their parents for being gay, and LGBT. First thing that the housing officer would do is phone the parents and ask them to take the child back or the young person back. And if they've just been kicked out by their parents for being LGBT, exactly, and it's an incredibly traumatic experience.
Welcome to Political Sandbox by Chamber for today's episode with Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor of London for Housing and Residential Development, on the issues of LGBT+ homelessness and housing. My name is Sean Anstee. I'm the former leader of Trafford Council in Greater Manchester and current Executive Director of Municipal Partners. Long history in housing policy, social housing in particular, sit on the board of the National Housing Federation, and have had political experience of seeing charities like the LGBT Foundation in Greater Manchester and AKT really look at some of the policy issues or solutions to some of the challenges that are faced by younger and older people, because these issues that we're going to discuss today talk about all ends of the age range. And so Tom is the Deputy Mayor for London, as I say, for Housing and Residential Development. You were obviously involved, welcome, and you were obviously involved in the opening of the UK's first LGBT+ retirement community, so we'll start there at Tonic at Bankhouse. And I wonder whether you might want to just give us some thoughts and reflections on that, and we can use that to start the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me on today to discuss what is a really important issue. So we're really proud to support Tonic at Bankhouse. It's the UK's, as you say, the UK's first LGBT affirming retirement community, which means affirms the lives, the history, the needs, the desires of LGBTQ people. And it's actually, if you think about it, quite remarkable, and not in a good way, that it was only in 2021 the UK got its first LGBT retirement community. Other cities around the world have done this already. And it's really important because older LGBT people face particular issues that others don't. And there are some really tragic stories, for example, of older LGBTQ people when they go into sort of ordinary extra care or retirement communities, feeling they have to go back into the closet, for example, which is really, really sad. And so Tonic is about creating a community where that doesn't need to happen, where people feel they can live their lives and be themselves. So it's 19 shared ownership apartments, 1 and 2 bed, right on the river at the scheme in Bankhouse. It's within an existing residential development run by One Housing, and One Housing worked really, really closely with Tonic to help deliver this scheme. And these were 19 shared ownership flats that weren't selling. And Tonic have sort of turned that around, and by creating essentially this sort of, by creating this new community, they are now selling these shared ownership apartments to older LGBTQ people. It's an absolutely fantastic scheme. I've been down. If you haven't been to visit it, I would highly recommend going to visit. They've done an incredible amount of work developing that community, and it brings all sorts of benefits to the people that live there. But also, we have in general in London and across the UK a sort of quite a big shortage of suitable accommodation for older people in order for them to downsize. People living in large properties, large houses. We need to create communities, not just LGBT communities, but other communities for older people, where people want to move, where they can downsize, and where they can free up, bigger properties for families. So there are an enormous number of benefits, not just for the people moving in, but for London, for society in general. So it's an absolutely fantastic and superb scheme, but they have ambitions not just to stop there. They want to continue to develop other schemes around London as well.
Fantastic. And to what extent do you think the UK is learning from other countries? As you were sort of saying, that 2021 was the first time for our first scheme, but clearly it's a drop in the ocean and it needs to scale, and we need to make sure that we're doing our best for older LGBT+ people to to grow old well, actually.
Absolutely, and I know that Tonic investigated and visited, I believe, other communities that already exist around the world. I think certainly in New York, there was a particular scheme there that they took a lot of learnings from. But also, this is very much, their own scheme, and it's been developed, in partnership with, communities in London. I'm really proud that the GLA, that City Hall, is supporting the scheme with a £5 million loan. So we're providing funding from our community housing fund, from the Mayor's Community Housing Fund, to get this off the ground. And I think there's real scope to scale it up. So one thing that Tonic are looking to do, and are in the process of, is registering as a registered provider, which means that they would be able to provide and manage homes for social rent. So as I say, at the moment, the scheme at Bankhouse is 100% shared ownership, and there are reasons for that. And it's a very good scheme, but obviously they have ambitions to develop beyond that, including for people on much lower incomes that wouldn't, necessarily be able to afford shared ownership. So I think that's going to be the next step for Tonic.
And at the LGBT plus inquiry session on housing and homelessness that we held a few weeks ago, one of the themes that came through that was that in order to be able to get something done on LGBT plus issues, so maybe it's with a particular local authority or whether it's the GLA or something, was by identifying somebody who had an interest in it. And so the question therefore is, how do you in effect mainstream this type of stuff so that it becomes the norm, that whether you're in metropolitan London, urban, rural Lincolnshire, that people are thinking about these types of schemes across the country?
Well, I think to some extent you have to be the first, and you have to provide proof of concept, and I think that's what Tonic have done. And I'll be honest, it was quite a long process, and so securing they'll say this as well, securing the funding from our community housing fund. It's quite a long and involved process, because this is something that hadn't been done before. But I think now that it's happened, and now we've got proof of concept, and now that people are starting to move into this, that is something that not just for us in London in terms of doing more of these, but other areas around the country as well. And I know that in Manchester that there is one in development, which I think is absolutely brilliant. But I think once you've got that proof of concept, and once it's up and running, which it is, that then you're going to get other local authorities, other cities around the country are going to be looking at that and going, yes, we want some of this as well.
Well, it's true to say, isn't it? Everything that works today was an idea once. So that means that needs to happen. Have you had? Can you share with us some of the stories, perhaps, that people who have moved into Tonic have shared with you, and the difference that it's made to their lives?
Yeah. So at the opening, I met a couple who had just registered to move into an apartment, and they. Currently, they had a large home in North London. Again, this is also about it supports people to downsize. And they said to me, and I remember this, that coming down to move into Tonic and moving down to Vauxhall felt like moving home. And I thought that was a really wonderful thing. And that really stuck with me. The idea of moving home and moving into a community that is affirming to you and to your lives.
Great.
So the Youth Homelessness Hub is not a specific LGBT service, but given that LGBT people are disproportionately likely to be young and homeless, it's a service that really helps. That does help young LGBT homeless people, and it's an absolutely fantastic service. I went down to visit with the mayor the other last year. And it's really useful because the needs and requirements of young homeless people, and particularly young LGBT homeless people, are quite different from the broader cohort of people who are rough sleeping, and placing young people into the same facilities as older people who've been rough sleeping doesn't always mean that they get the kind of service that they need that's specifically tailored to them. So it's a really, really important service. And beyond that as well, on the homelessness side, we also fund the Outside project, which is a scheme that provides a day centre for young people, for LGBT people, who are experiencing homelessness.
And Tom, we've talked a little bit about, whether it's local authorities, the GLA, whether it's charities, whether it's registered providers. These are complex issues that have got a number of organisations that are seeking to help, but sometimes pulling the machinery together is quite challenging. Do you think that's one of your key roles, is sort of leading the charge from the front to sort of identify the issue, get people to cooperate with each other and try and not just talk about doing things, but actually do things?
Yeah, I think the GLA and the Mayor has a major convening role in lots and lots of areas, and this is one of them. And it's also the case that that City Hall can commission pan-London services that individual boroughs, for example, wouldn't be able to commission locally, because the number of people that would actually be eligible for that service locally is very, very small. But obviously, if you scale that up to a pan-London level, it makes sense for the GLA to do it, and that's the case for the rough sleeping services that the Mayor provides. It's looking at where there are gaps that can't be and services that can't be delivered or couldn't be delivered effectively on a borough level, and commissioning those at a London-wide level. And I think that works well, and that's the case with, for example, the Youth Homelessness Hub that we've commissioned with London councils. It makes sense to do it on a larger level.
And given the housing crisis more generally that sits around affordability of homes, particularly in London, but also the need for perhaps health and wellbeing support, perhaps skills and employment support, there must be opportunities to be able to support young people who are homeless, but then to try and make sure that they don't return to being homeless in the future. What's your view on that?
Well, we have a very, very good record actually through the services that the Mayor commissions from City Hall. So 85% of the people that have come through the Mayor's services are not seen rough sleeping again, for example. The Mayor's services have helped more than 12,000 people since 2016. So these are big, big numbers. I think the challenge that we've got is that where we're helping people through the Mayor's services and the Mayor's rough sleeping services, it's usually where people are already sleeping rough. I think the challenge for us and the difficulty for us is it's the number of people that are being pushed onto the streets, and it's difficult for us to help those people that far downstream because we don't have the resources or the ability to do that. A lot of that is to do with stuff that's happening nationally in terms of welfare policy and things like that mean that people find themselves on the streets. So I think that's a difficulty for us in London. I'm really proud of the work that the Mayor's services is doing. But we still have that flow of people coming onto the streets because of factors that essentially are outside of our control at City Hall and outside the control of the boroughs as well.
And what do you think would make the key difference for you then on that? So if there was a particular power or reform that would help the GLA and the boroughs and indeed authorities across the country have a greater number of items in their toolbox, what would be the thing that would spring to mind?
I mean, I know it's basically money is essentially the issue. I mean, I know it sounds a bit simplistic, but we have had very challenging times, particularly for local government, in terms of the sort of disproportionate cuts to local government budgets, in terms of the caps on welfare, and the homelessness crisis is not just a product of the housing crisis. It's also to do with the fact that people simply can't afford the rent because the benefit payments will not cover the increasing cost of rent because of things like the LHA caps and total benefit cap and things like that. And that's hit us very hard in London. And it has made it more challenging in terms of the number of people coming onto the streets. So, I'm particularly at a time now where we've got pretty much everything going up except for wages in terms of our cost of living crisis. I think it's even more crucial now that the government does relax these restrictions and these caps on welfare, because it is pushing people into homelessness. It's also pushing people into overcrowding. because where families can't afford to rent a property that's of the suitable size, they are having to rent smaller properties with all of the problems for their children, in terms of health, in terms of the impact on education and things like that. So I do think it is really, really crucial that we get the support that's needed in order for people to be able to afford to rent, as well, of course, as investing in the particularly social housing, but other genuinely affordable housing as well, so that rather than people having to rent at a very high rent from a private landlord paid for by LHA rates, they can rent at a much more affordable rent from a social landlord.
Great. And you sort of talked in your answer then, Tom, about the scale of the problem, overcrowding, hidden homelessness. To what extent, how do you know what the scale of the problem is, and where do you get your data from, and what can be used to try and make more transparent, I think, the issue, so that we can try and move forward the debate and, as I say, get some solutions and get people working together?
So there are certain data sources that we've got. In London, on the rough sleeping side, we have a very, very comprehensive database called the Chain database, which is far more detailed and far more accurate than the government snapshot data. This is a very detailed database of everybody that we know who is sleeping rough. That gives us a very, very accurate picture of the number of people on the streets. Fortunately, it has been falling recently. It was up to around 10,000 a year. It has been falling, partly due to the incredible effort that went into everyone during the pandemic. We have pretty good data when it comes to temporary accommodation and households in temporary accommodation, because local authorities, have that information. The slightly more mysterious one, of course, is the hidden homelessness. And back when I was on the London Assembly, we did a report into hidden homelessness, which I think it was one of the most interesting bits of work that we've done. We calculated through that report at the time there were 13 times more people in London hidden homeless than on the streets. One thing that came out of that as well was the sort of disproportionate impact of a disproportionate number of LGBT people who are hidden homeless, and some of the ways in which local authorities need to improve the way that they deal with young LGBT people. So, for example, we found it was all too common where a young person would arrive at the housing options service saying that they'd been kicked out by their parents for being gay, and LGBT. First thing that the housing officer would do is phone the parents and ask them to take the child back, or the young person back. And if they've just been kicked out by their parents for being LGBT,
the last place they want to be.
Exactly, and it's an incredibly traumatic experience. So I think there are, I understand completely. Local authorities are incredibly overstretched, probably more than they ever have been. But I think there needs to be a more sensitive way of dealing with young people where they do present as homeless because they've been kicked out for being LGBT at their local council.
The pandemic, which you just referenced then, clearly a hugely challenging time for many families, many nations, well, globally actually. But what it did do in many respects was made the seemingly impossible possible, and it made the speed in which the public and private sector could work to resolve issues, it just happened. How do you get that mentality into solving issues like LGBT plus homelessness, thinking about housing policy, so that the urgency within which it deserves to be treated is actually a reality as well?
Yeah, so I think what the pandemic and what everyone showed was, where local government, national government, the charitable sector, and crucially as well, our health services, the NHS, all work together. But really importantly, where the funding is made available, it is actually possible to make a massive difference to homelessness. And obviously, there were some unique circumstances in the pandemic, because we had available hotel rooms that could be booked out for people to move into because there was no tourism. But I think it did demonstrate that where there is a political will and crucially funding, that we can move towards ending rough sleeping. I think it was quite remarkable. And I do think there has been a bit of a shift in terms of the government's attitude to this, and in terms of how seriously the government is taking the issue of rush sleeping. And obviously the government has its own target to end rush sleeping by the end of this Parliament. But it is going to take significant investment. The other thing that did strike me, though, although I say significant investment, and that is true, if you're looking at, and we spent, just in London, we spent and were provided with, from the government, tens of millions of pounds to help people to self-isolate in hotels. But if you actually look at that in the context of the overall budget and what was spent more broadly on the pandemic, on things like test and trace, it's actually, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively small amount of money. But it just needs to be spent, and it needs to be committed in order to deal with this. And I do think, just going back to the point I made earlier, we can spend this money helping people off the streets. We can also spend a bit more money up front on preventing people from getting onto the streets in the first place. And that, to me, is, prevention is always better than cure.
Great. And Tom, just before we started this interview, you were it's a conversation even rather than an interview. We were talking about your 2 years in post. Now, I mean, what a 2 years. I don't think you could have predicted it 2 years ago where you were. But if you were to look forward to the future, what do you think's next for the GLA and LGBT plus homelessness and housing policy?
I think one of the big things that I want to make sure is, just going back to Tonic, is that we support them to expand what they're doing. And I know that they're already in discussions with other organisations about the potential to create the next Tonic elsewhere in London. And to me, that's really, really exciting. And as part of that, as I say, they're registering to be a registered provider of social housing, and I would absolutely love us at the GLA to be able to support them to provide some homes for low cost rent as part of a future Tonic, because I think we need to be making sure that we're supporting LGBTQ people, older LGBTQ people, at all sort of income levels, in order to be able to retire into a community where they feel that they are affirmed and valued. So to me, I think that's a crucial thing. We also want to make sure that we're continuing to support the youth homelessness hub. It's going to have to move out of the building that it's currently in. That was always going to be the case. It was always a time-limited offer on the building before it was redeveloped. So we're looking to support them in moving to a new location and to continue to provide that service. We also, the GLA, we've recently taken on a new duty under the Domestic Abuse Act. So we are now responsible as a Tier 1 authority for commissioning services for victims of domestic abuse. We're currently going through that commissioning process. And I'm very keen to make sure, as part of that, and we are expressly asked for bids for this, services to support LGBTQ victims of domestic abuse as well. So I think those are the three key areas going forward, as well as just continuing to try to deliver the genuinely affordable homes that everyone needs, regardless of whether you're LGBTQ or not. That's really, really important as well.
Great. Well, you've got a huge amount to do. Thank you for taking the time out to be with us today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and good luck for the future.
Thank you.